and Cleveland 21 months later. My faith in the American people has been vindicated.
I understand very well the responsibilities associated and the great burdens of office.
You could say that in some ways the parties did eventually go with type, that the Republicans often go for the old soldier.
The leadership and experience to call for the surge strategy in Iraq that is working. John McCain.
And the Democrats do have a weak spot for the new generation, the transformational, change-bringing mythology that goes back to John F. Kennedy, if not before.
Despite the economic crisis and war and uncertainty about tomorrow, I still see optimism.
There was also recognition on the Republican side that in a year in which George W. Bush has record unpopularity, they needed someone who could be somehow distinct and separate from the Republican brand.
Guys, feeling great. Cindy let me sleep last night.
There was a period in the primary battle where it looked as if Barack Obama could well just be knocked out, and that was the emergence of this figure, the Reverend Jeremiah Wright, his former pastor, who had made these incendiary speeches. How he dealt with that in some ways reflected how he dealt with crises throughout the rest of his campaign. He stepped back and very coolly went for the big picture and delivered a speech in Philadelphia on race, which I've spoken to people who've heard 50 or 60 years worth of American political speeches who say that is actually the very best they've heard.
We may not look the same and may not have come from the same place, but we all want to move in the same direction towards a better future for our children and our grandchildren.
And I think set himself on the road for how people might view him now, which is as a potentially transformational president.
She's exactly who I need. She's exactly who this country needs to help me fight.
Sarah who was the reaction? Nobody in the American media pretty well had even heard of her. She was the governor of Alaska. She'd only been in there 20 months. From her very first appearance, she showed a kind of star quality. The camera just immediately loved her.
I will be honored to accept your nomination for Vice President of the United States.
She certainly did galvanize the Republican base at first. You know, John McCain needed that because he didn't really have strong loyalty among that base. But I think it's pretty clear that the final verdict will be that she was a drag on the ticket and that she hurt more than she helped. A lot of independent, moderate voters, voters in the middle, just think she's completely unqualified for the job.
Inevitably, there was a lot of discussion about Barack Obama's big address to the convention. He took a big risk by moving it out of the convention center and going to the Invesco Stadium. 84,000 people, incredibly atmospheric. On the other hand, there wasn't actually a memorable line that people will take away. But in a way that was deliberate, and not just deliberate, but actually very smart. What he needed to show was that he was steady, calm, methodical, and that he had a plan for the country.
You know who voted for it? You might never know. That one. You know who voted against it? Me.
I think the end result of the three presidential debates is that a lot of people who didn't know very much about Obama became persuaded that he was probably up to the job of being president.
He voted 23 times against alternative fuels.
John McCain, by contrast, came across as actually somewhat less serious than Obama.
He just couldn't get the sort of body language right. Either he was strolling across the stage, or he was huffing and puffing and sighing and looking as if he was a man really keeping the lid on a furious temper. Meanwhile, Barack Obama didn't take any of the opportunities to deliver a knockout punch or a zinger, but that was deliberate.
He established in those three contests the idea that he could plausibly be the president.
The game changer in the end came along not from anything the candidates did, but something that happened in the real world, namely the Wall Street collapse.
These are not normal circumstances.
Basically, John McCain lost this election by saying the same sentence one too many times, and that sentence was, the fundamentals of the economy are strong. He said this in mid-September, just at the time when Lehman Brothers was failing and the collapse of Wall Street was beginning, and indeed seemed to suggest to the American people that he was out of touch with their everyday concerns.
People were comparing it to 1968. In some ways, it's more eventful even than that. In the end, though, it has come down to a very familiar template. Change or more of the same.
This was something that we saw Barack Obama hammering home throughout the campaign, linking John McCain to the policies of George Bush.
John McCain has stood with President Bush every step of the way. I mean, he hasn't been a maverick, he's been a sidekick.
John McCain, meanwhile, has tried to wriggle out of any association with the incumbent President George W. Bush, who's breaking records for his unpopularity.
I am not President Bush. If you wanted to run against President Bush, you should have run 4 years ago.
McCain kind of went from Obama's inexperience to Obama's lack of preparedness to Obama's supposed radicalism to Obama's inability to defend the country against terrorists and enemies. So there were 4 or maybe even more different lines of attack.
My opponent is working out the details with Speaker Pelosi and Senator Reid, their plans to raise your taxes, increase spending, and concede defeat in Iraq.
In a year like this, Americans, it seems, if the polls are right, are desperate for change.